Good morning. Welcome again to everyone. Well, Lord Jesus, we want to thank you for this morning, and we just want to give this time to you as we share together and learn about how to write a news story, and in a way that will really be inviting and also glorify you. So we thank you and we give you the praise. Be with Gina and be with each of us that will understand and use the material that we learn well. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thanks for letting me meet with all you guys tonight over here in the States, and then at different times of day that you guys are in different places. So it's just a real privilege to get to be together with you. As Lisa said, my name is Gina, and I guess a reason that she invited me to speak with you is I'm really passionate about helping Nazarenes tell our stories of what God is doing among us in all the different places that we live and where we're working, and just how communicating and telling our stories and our news brings us closer together across all the miles and all the languages and the cultures, because we are one body as a denomination. So that's something that I'm really passionate about. And I served in communications at the Global Ministry Center for several years through Global Mission and NMI. And then I served in missions and communications in the Eurasia region for almost 10 years. So now I'm living in Colorado, back in the United States. And I guess tonight we're going to be talking about news stories and what makes a news story, and a little bit why we would do that as Nazarenes, why we would use news as a way that we communicate. And I would love to invite any of you to, jump in, interrupt me with a question. You can, I think, maybe put something in the chat. If I miss it, Lisa, maybe you can just flag me or stop me. I want you all to be able to discuss or add comments and things like that. So it's not just me talking. And then we can maybe, if any of you have a news story that you're working on, we can look at that toward the end, along with some discussion, ask some questions, talk about the presentation. But first, I just wanted to ask, do all of you read news stories in your culture? Do you look at newspapers or news websites? And if you do, would maybe one or two of you just share why you do that and how that adds to your life or how that benefits you?
I read, lately I've been reading news about what's happening in our country, especially this season is an election season. So it helps me see or know who are the people that are running for election. And, sometimes it annoys me because it's like a circus these past few days with all the different drama in politics. But it's really giving me a lot of idea who should I vote, or what are the different things happening in our country in the midst of the pandemic and election.
That's great. A few more of you just joined, and I just asked the question if any of you want to respond. If you read the news in your country, or if you read world news, how does that benefit you when you do?
I also, for me, I also look for different types of news because we are also learning how to write news, especially these days that, one of the participants here, Rachel, we are the ones looking for stories and writing and rewriting those stories for our region. So it really helps us to see the different kinds of news out there and the different styles of how news is being written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the best ways to learn how to write is to read the kind of things that you're going to be writing. So that's a really good way of actually practicing. I know that I will often read through any world news that's about a country where we have churches. So if I see a headline about a hurricane or a typhoon or an earthquake, and I know we have churches in that country, I will want to find out what's happening for our Nazarenes in the places where they live around the world. Well, we've had quite a few more people jump into the call, so it seems like maybe a good time to transition to this PowerPoint that I put together to kind of guide us. And I'm going to see if I can share this. So hopefully it is going to be showing you my PowerPoint screen. Looks like a few of you can see it. Thanks for that feedback. So first, I just want to cover what is a news story. I think most of us know a news story when we see it, but we don't think about what makes that a news story instead of a personal story or a profile of a person or history or many of the other kinds of writing. So the thing that really makes a news story is the fact that it is very recent. So it covers very recent current events, things that have happened in the last few days, the last 24 hours, the last few weeks. And it should almost always answer, in English, we call it the 5 W's and the H, because in English, the questions that we're answering start with those letters. So if you can see my cursor over here, we have who, what, where, when, why, and how. So that's why we call it the 5 W's and the H. And it really helps us in English anyway, to really remember those 6 questions that we're trying to answer for the reader in the story that we're writing. And I made a little note here that feature articles are different in that they're usually longer stories and they cover a topic really deep. So not just quick answers, but they will cover a subject with a lot more detail. And sometimes they're more creative and they will have more of the human feeling to it than a news story. And I put a question here about why we would write news. Like, why would Christians or why would Nazarenes care to write news for each other? And I was wondering if any of you had some suggestions or ideas why we would do that as Christians or as Nazarenes.
I would say, just off the top of my head, I know I write news just to let people know things that are happening, things to rejoice about, things to be part of or take part in, participate in, even for this webinar to share what's coming up. So it's more informative, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, it brings us together as a church family when we have the same knowledge and the same information. Anybody else have an idea?
Yeah, we also want to inspire other people of what's happening, in other regions or in other churches or in other people's lives, how their life was transformed.
So I'll uncover my answer. I think those are both correct and good answers. I put that we actually serve the reader, and I underlined the word serve because as a writer, especially when I was writing for the church, the Nazarene church, we wrote through Engage magazine. There may be a few of you that remember that, through the Nazarene News website and newsletter, and through the Eurasia News. I always had a sense that I was serving, that this was a way God had allowed me to serve the church. And it really helps make everything easier for the rest of our church when we can provide clear, current news about what God is doing, because we're providing relevant information. So it's information that people want or need to know. When we write well, we're making it easy for people to understand. They don't have to work hard. We're doing the hard work as an act of service to write a good story that's clear. And we want it, if it's news, we want it to be something people can read in a few minutes, and then they can go on with cooking for their family or going to their job or participating in ministry. So those are three. There's many other reasons, but those were the three that I thought of when I was putting this together for you all. And there's a couple other things that make, and I'm moving my PowerPoint because your pictures are in front of it, so I need to be able to see it. But there's another thing that makes a news story different from other kinds of stories. It's the fact that when someone's reading the news story, you as the writer or the reporter, you disappear. So they don't think about you. The reader doesn't think about who wrote this and what was their perspective and what, what's their opinion. We don't talk in, we call it third person in English, third person point of view. So we use words like they, he, him. We don't ever say we or I because we are not part of the story. Even if we were at the conference or the children's vacation Bible school or something, we remove ourselves from this story. And that's what makes it a news story instead of a personal testimony or, a first person report. And one thing I've seen when I was editing articles that Nazarenes wrote for me, that I asked them to write for me, they would go to a conference that I couldn't go to because it was too far away. And then they would send me the article and they would quote themselves. So we can't do that. We have to quote other people who were part of the story. So that's just kind of one thing that just makes this different from another type of thing that we would write. So we don't share our own opinions. We don't talk about our experiences. Really, what I like about news as an active service is we are elevating the voices and the perspective and experiences of other people, not ourselves. So we're really taking the focus off ourselves as writers, and we're putting the focus on the other people that we're writing about. So I wanted to also go in a little more depth on the 5 W's and the H, because this is going to keep coming up for the next hour. So the who would be the people who are involved with what we're writing about, or the people who were affected by the events that we're writing about. The what would be the main subject matter of the story. So that there was a district assembly, or there was a large gathering of children for a children's ministry, or there was a natural disaster, whatever the subject of the story is. We want to talk about when it happened. So it happened yesterday, it happened last Sunday, or the fact that it's coming soon. So I don't know, Lisa, how you told people about the webinar tonight, but there could have been, you may have done some kind of news report short saying that this event was coming and who it was open for and what it was going to be about. So it can also be something in the future.
Right.
You might talk about where it's happening. So the setting could be the nation, depending on what type of story it is, or a neighborhood of a city. It could be where the local church is. And then it's really important to talk about the why. So why, in the back of your mind, every time you write a news story, try to ask yourself, why does the reader care? Why would the reader read this story? Because otherwise there's no point in us taking the time to do this unless it's somehow important for the person who will read the story. And part of the way we can answer that question is, why did this event happen? That will really help people feel they should read the story. They should know about this event that you're writing about. And then the how, in English, we started with the word how. How did the events occur? And how did God use those events? Maybe could be another answer. And that goes to another point, that there will pretty much always be more than one of each of these questions to answer. There could be several what, several who, several why, several how. So we want to make sure that we don't limit ourselves in our mind when we're trying to answer these questions in our story. Something you can ask yourself when you look at a news website is why do you read some of the stories but not read other stories?
Right.
Because all of us make decisions when we're seeing headlines. We will say no to more stories than we will say yes to, as far as how we spend our time and what we will read. So that's another good way to practice when you're reading the news, is to ask yourself why sometimes you don't read it. Why did it not capture your attention or interest you? Why was it not important to you to know that information just as much as it was important to know?
So who defines the why? Do the writer himself or herself define the why, or the news itself define the why, or the audience that you are trying to reach out define the why? So who defines the why? If we cannot talk about, we cannot include ourselves in the story, then therefore I cannot tell them the why.
Mm-hmm.
It should be the news or the people who are listening to the story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's everything you said is correct.
It cannot be my why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, news writing or any kind of writing is always two directions. So the writer is communicating, but they're trying to listen to the reader by trying to understand what is in the mind of the reader, potentially, because we can't read people's minds. But through our relationships, through knowing our culture, through knowing what our friends and family are talking about, we get to be in the minds, or we can kind of anticipate what someone will be interested in. We might be wrong. As you know, what I just said, there's a lot of stories I don't read. So the writer didn't catch me in the group of people that they were writing to, because I personally was not interested. So there's
is there a at least a help, for us writers, to know, how to write the why for our audience, that we may be able to catch them, that because whether we like it or not, we're part of the story. We're writing this story, and the opinion is somehow, may not be there stated, but it's there. It's still there.
You're right.
Everything you have written is really part of you, and so and that's you. And so I think that there helps, to at least help us arrest our audience, and that word arrest, get them, hook them.
Yeah. So you would ask, who do I want to be my audience? That's always a first question. Who do I have in my mind that I want to read this story? So there are people who will write articles about celebrities. So there's a certain type of person who wants to read celebrity stories. So that's who they have in their mind. I'm not the person they have in their mind when they're writing a celebrity story. And as she said, there are some people who know there are people who are interested in upcoming elections. They want to know how to most wisely use their vote. That might be a certain kind of people, but the people reading celebrity stories might not read the story about the upcoming election. So one way you can sort of help yourself is to ask, who would I be writing this for? Maybe you even know somebody in your own personal life, like another person in ministry, or a family member. And I've heard editors say, write to that one person in your mind, because they represent other people like them who will want to know the story you're writing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And you talk about the election, for example. Every time I see a news story of the election, sometimes I'm turned off by the kind of language they use. That makes them biased already. or sometimes by the kind of picture they want to portray somebody. And so even the pictures turns me off. So we have to be very careful in how, what is it that we are doing? Are we communicating the news, or are we trying to communicate an agenda?
Right.
Because that's very dangerous.
And that's why I believe it's so important for Christians to be involved in this type of writing, because we answer to a higher power in the ethics of how we write, and the fact that we are doing our very best to serve people and not to accomplish something that's our own goal, or to convince people about something by withholding some information that they would have changed their mind, or telling them something where we intentionally manipulate the way we write it to be misleading or things like that. So I do think that it can be a calling, that Christ is calling people who love him and love people to do journalism, to do news writing the way that would please God, if that makes sense. Yeah, thank you. Those were awesome questions. Really, really good questions. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So Lisa had asked me to talk a little bit about the structure of a news story, the way a news story is shaped in terms of the importance of the information as you go on. So we call this in journalism an upside down or an inverted pyramid, because the most important information and the most of the 5 W's and the why that we can answer in the shortest amount of space always happens at the beginning. And so if you look at the bullet points over on the side, I included in the top of the pyramid, you would have your headline. So that's the title of the article. And then the very first sentence that you read in the story, in English, journalists call it a lead, but we spell it wrong, which is very ironic. We spell lead, L-E-D-E. And apparently there's a historical reason why journalists in America deliberately misspelled that word, but I'm going to use it because that's what I was trained with when I worked in newspapers. So the very first sentence is the most important sentence of the whole article, because that sentence is going to help the reader decide if they're going to keep reading, or if they're too busy or they're not interested and they're going to stop right there. And then the next section would be the very next paragraph. And in English, we call it a nut graph, because in English, we have a saying, tell me the story in a nutshell. So how much of the story can you fit in the tiniest thing, which would be the shell of a nut? So that's why we call it a nut graph. You can just think of it as the first or the second paragraph. Most people only read those 3 things and then they finish. They go do something else. I am definitely also one of those people. And if you start to pay attention to how you read the news, I imagine that you will notice you are doing the same thing. You're reading the headline only. Many times when I scan through my favorite news sites, I only read the headlines. That's it. I don't even read the stories. Or I might click on it and I read the first sentence and I think, okay, I got it. And then I go to the next headline. As you continue writing, if you are successful in capturing their attention with those first 3 things, then people will move on to the supporting details of the story, which is the main body of your article. And that's where you will start to notice that people put in quotes from people they interviewed. So it's the full direct words that someone told the writer, and they put it in English, we call it the quote marks. I even know in England, they call it something else. That's where you start to get more of the answers to the 5 W's and the H. And you present the information, the most important down to the least important, again, because all the way through the article, you are losing readers. So you want them to get all the information until they stop reading. And then at the very end of your story is the least important information. Sometimes it's a good place to put a nice little quote from one of the people that you interviewed that sort of gives you a good conclusion or a nice summary of the full story. Sometimes you can put links to more information, like if you say you did an article about alabaster offerings, maybe you put a link to the main Nazarene webpage about alabaster, or to another article that you wrote in the past about alabaster, or an NCM project. So if you wrote about something that NCM is involved with, Nazarene Compassionate Ministries, maybe you put a link to their project so that people can respond to your article by giving to the same thing you wrote about. Let's see. I think that pretty much covers it. Does anyone have a question about this structure?
What do you say about headlines that agitates rather than hook you into the story?
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, they're not communicating what they're trying to say, but they're just trying to hook you into the story. But really, if a reader is so lazy that he gets the wrong story,
Mm-hmm.
just because of the headline and just because of the lead, that's written there. So it's kind of, I know it's not a fair journalism. And it's not a godly journalism, because I
Right.
think even and that's sad, because even among us in the biblical studies, there tend to be other news writers who would communicate the wrong message in their headlines, just to get our attention and read. but and sometimes we would say, no, I don't think I believe in this, but the author would say, have you read the story? And I said, I didn't read the story. Well, I'm trying to say the other way around. And I said, well, your headline is so poor, and I think it agitated me rather than invites me to engage in the story. So sometimes that's a problem.
It is a problem in what I don't know if I accurately call it secular news, newspapers, main news websites. I would like to think that as Christians, we have a different goal when we sit down to start writing. What you talked about, you said it tries to hook you, which is a good word, because in English, we call it clickbait. So when you go fishing, the thing that you put on the hook to make the fish come and bite on the hook is bait. So they make the headline like bait, so you will click it. But the headline maybe does not match the story. And some do this on purpose because their money comes from how many people click on that article. So unfortunately, if you're writing news to make a profit, not like which is nothing wrong with that, but it causes the temptation for corruption to make that profit. There's a lot of pressure on Western. I don't know how it is around the world. I only know my context. But when I worked at a newspaper and the internet began to really expand and there was a lot of competition, my newspaper every couple of months had a big layoff, and they fired many employees because we were losing money. We couldn't afford to pay people to do the journalism. And so my coworkers were losing their jobs. So there was a lot of pressure, and the pressure twisted the way we were trying to do the news. And that's just the world that we live in. But I hope that as Nazarenes, we are not really writing for profit. So that takes away one kind of pressure that might add temptation to twist the way we write to force or manipulate people to read what we're writing. We have a different mindset or a different goal. I do think it's interesting. I read a book by a journalist that I very much respect, and she showed the research in the last just a couple of years of how many articles where the headline and the first paragraph directly contradicted the information in the rest of the article because they knew people weren't going to read the rest of the article.
Oh.
So they were hoping people would read the headline and read the first paragraph and get a wrong picture of the story. So yes, you have to be, I'm also very passionate that as Christians who are dedicated to truth, that we are very vigilant and we are not naive when we read the news. But that's not really what I'm concerned about with you all as we learn how to write. That would be a whole nother webinar that I would be happy to talk with you about another time. But that's a great question because that does happen. And we want to make sure that we don't be like the world when we write as well. So again, I just have another slide about this structure. And so I think this is actually redundant. I probably don't need to go over this slide again. So I wanted to talk to you also about the research side because writing the news is the last thing you do, actually. To write a news story, you have to have already done research and you have to have interviewed people, usually. And so when I started as a journalist, I was really nervous about my interviews and I was concerned that I would forget something important to ask. So I always, and even to this day, I always make a list of my questions so that I'm prepared when I talk to people. And I just gave some very general questions on this screen, only to show that there can be many ways to answer the question of when, of why, of who, just because there are lots of things that readers will ask themselves as they're reading the story. And we want to try to imagine as many questions as possible that someone might ask so that we already have the answer in the story. Our goal is that no one leaves our story with a question that we didn't answer. And it's okay. We're not going to be perfect, but we should aim to do our best in this area. And one thing that happens is too, when I'm in the middle of an interview, I will think of a new question that I didn't know to ask before. So I will add that as we're talking. Or just this week, I was interviewing someone for a story for seminary, for the Nazarene Seminary in Kansas City. And after we finished the interview and I was writing the article, I realized I had new questions. So I sent another email with a few more questions because I just didn't think of it while we were talking. And you'll always write your questions based on the story that you're going to write. So that's why these are very, very general questions. You will probably have much more specific questions.
Are those in order? Are those in order? The order of the questions,
No.
are those in the order of importance or just,
No. Just what I thought of. I just wrote it down.
Okay.
Yeah. Because especially when I wrote these questions that you're looking at, I did not have a specific story in my mind. So I interviewed two pastors in the last couple of weeks who are working together at a church. And one of them is going to become the lead pastor, and the other one will eventually leave and become a full-time family and marriage counselor. So I did write my questions in order. So kind of like, how did you get your call to ministry? How did you prepare for ministry? What ministries have you done over your life so far? How did you get to this church? And how did you begin to understand God was calling you out of this kind of ministry into a new ministry? And, those kind of questions. So it followed the order of their life story, if that makes sense. So I wanted to talk a bit more about the interview. I think this is the hardest or the scariest, more frightening part I've noticed for people who are starting to write articles is going and talking to people. It's uncomfortable sometimes, or it makes you nervous. But I remember when I started as a newspaper reporter in my very first job, and I was always so nervous before I went to talk to people. And then it was so funny. After I interviewed this one lady, at the end, she said, "Oh, I was so nervous." So I realized they're probably more nervous than we are, because they want to get it right. They want to do a good job. So everyone's nervous. So then we can all, be comfortable. But one of the most important, I feel like it's a bit of an ethical rule, is that if possible, we should try to always interview a minimum of 2 people when we write an article. And I'm going to uncover this box here. So I think there's several good reasons for doing this. In the Bible, if you notice in the Old Testament rules, as God was laying out the rules for justice and mercy for his people, for his nation, he says that there are always 2 witnesses required in a case of dispute. And there's lots of countries today that have a justice system where someone cannot be convicted of a crime unless there's 2 witnesses. There's good reasons for this that I think also apply to when we write a news article. It's a safety thing that one person can, if you only talk to one person, they can both lie, they can be deceived, or they can just be mistaken about something. So if we talk to at least 2 people, we're comparing their information that they're giving us. And I have a good example of why in the church, I still think this is a good idea, even though we aren't going to worry that a Sunday school teacher is lying to us. But one time I interviewed a man who organized a large evangelistic concert, and I was writing a story about it. And I said, "And how many people do you think came to the concert?" And he said, "Oh, it was huge. There was about 15, maybe 20,000 people at the concert." So I wrote that down. Okay, we had 15 to 20,000 people came to the concert. And then I talked to the pastor who helped organize it. And he's like, "Yeah, we counted. There was about 2,500. Big difference between 2,000 and 20,000. And it wasn't that the first man lied. He just was very excited. And like me, he cannot look at a large crowd and get an accurate number. I can't do that either. Sure. So it was a good thing that I talked to the pastor, because he actually counted with a group of people and had that number specifically. And I really like this quote. I hope you can see it at the bottom. This is something I love to think about when I was writing for the church. Trust, but verify. So we don't approach people with the assumption that they're wrong, or they're mistaken, or they're trying to manipulate us. It's just that we want to verify what they're telling us. So I like that. Also, another benefit of interviewing 2, 3, 4, 5 people, I like to interview as many people as I can in the amount of time I have, is they all give us different perspectives that really enrich the story, that really show us the same thing from lots of different angles and experiences. Sometimes people will experience the exact same thing in very different ways. We know that in our own relationships, when we're remembering a story that happened to the 2 of us, and one person is totally having a totally different memory of it. So it's good to have different voices, especially if we can talk, like if we write an article about, say there was a flood. So we might interview the Nazarene churches that came, like the pastors or the NCM leaders, tell us what happened when you came and you did this disaster relief. But then if we can, either ourselves or we ask someone who was there, also talk to the people who received the relief, or who were neighbors who jumped in the moment to help our team help their neighbors. Maybe we talked to a town leader too about what it means for the community to have our church come help them. So there's many different voices. We shouldn't stop at the most important person or the leader. We should also include even the I don't want to rank people by importance, but according to the world's view of who's important, we don't want to treat people that way. So we try to talk to everybody at different perspectives. When we do an interview, it's really important to write down or record with a device as many exact words in the exact way they said it as possible, because we will want to take some of what they said in their own words with the quote marks around it so that we are not putting words in their mouth. They are speaking for themselves. And as a Christian journalist, I always felt that this was a matter of human dignity and respect for their voice and their words. So that's why I really encourage us to do that if we can. I like to get contact information, how I can reach them afterwards, so that if I have a new question, I can ask. And I like, this is something we're not allowed to do in secular journalism, but I really like to do it in Christian journalism, is show them the article or the part of the article they are in before we publish it, because it's really easy to miscommunicate. And we might not understand something that they told us. And we want them to know that we did our best to be accurate in publishing what they said about their experience. And I also think it's really important to ask open-ended questions, which means that we're not assuming what their answer is going to be. So sometimes I have to rewrite my questions, because I might write it as, what did you like about this webinar? Which means they have to answer that they liked something, that you liked something. Instead, I will try to rewrite it as, what was your reaction to what you learned in the webinar? Was it helpful? They can then say, no, it actually, you could write an article and one of you could say, actually, I already knew all this information. It was not helpful. Or you could say, I really didn't learn anything. She talked too fast. But we don't want to lead people into answers we hope they're giving us. We also don't want to say, did you like the webinar? Because then they can just say, yes, or no. We want to ask questions that lead people to give us a much more detailed answer. So we call it not yes, no questions, but a question with an open end to it, so they can decide how they want to answer our questions.
Gina, I want to add just a thought here too. I recently, a couple months ago, was interviewing a person who's actually a friend of mine. And I don't know if this happens too in interviews, but she just got really involved in what she was sharing, and she got excited. She was just talking, and I was doing my best to take as much notes on what she was saying as I could. When I referred back to and shared back to her what I had written, there were several points that I had misunderstood or misinterpreted. And so I wonder, is it ever, it might not be possible in the moment, because sometimes the time is limited when you're with the person, but to just rephrase back to them, or somehow, clarify in that moment a little bit of what you're understanding that they're saying, if it doesn't miss the, if it doesn't miss the enthusiasm, but I wondered how do you handle that sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, double checking while you're interviewing is great, because then you don't have to find them later, which can be hard, especially if we're doing cross-cultural or interviews from where we traveled and then we left the area, which happened to me sometimes. I think also I will ask people, stop talking for 1 second. It was so good what you said. I want to make sure I get it exactly right. So they'll pause and I will write and I will say, okay, the last thing I remember you said was this.
Okay.
What did you say after that? And then they'll say, oh yeah, I was saying such and such. And okay, wait, stop again. I'm still too slow. That's what I
Right.
say. I'm too slow.
Okay.
I like to sometimes have two methods. I like to write by hand, but I also might have my phone recording
Okay.
or my computer. That's really helpful as long as they give you permission,
Sure.
as long as they know you're recording. So yeah, it is hard though. People speak fast. And sometimes they don't speak. Sometimes all of us don't speak in complete sentences. We jump in the middle and it's not easy all the time.
That's good.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And I like that reminder too, and to really ask them before you choose to record them with an electronic format, because yeah.
And I had one more little thing here is why we do interviews. I think people will skip the interview because they just want to get to the story, but it's really important to remember why we're doing it. First of all, it's one of the best ways to gather the information that you need. It's also a good way to double check your facts. So even if you were there as the event happened, it's still good to make sure that you have the same facts, numbers, data, everything as the people who are responsible or were also there. You can write down these first person reactions. So you can write down how someone told you it felt when they lost their home in an earthquake or a flood and someone came to help, or how it felt to have their child be enrolled in a sponsorship program and things like that. That goes to the next point, is that the why, going back to our discussion about why should a reader care, most of us care or we're interested in other people more than we're interested in just an event. So the more people that we can put in the story, or the more that we can dive deep into one or two persons' experience of the event, the more likely the reader will keep reading to find out what happened to that person, that they feel some kind of human connection to them. Or we kind of like, we just want to know, how did that story end for that person? So I know when I was a missionary and I would travel to churches and give presentations about what God was doing in Europe and Eurasia, afterward, almost every single time I spoke, someone came and said, "Thank you for telling me stories about the people." I can't remember the numbers. I can't remember the facts, but I remember that woman you talked about who almost lost her baby and God did a miracle, or that person, who God really, saved them in an interesting way. So that's, again, it's a news story, but nobody cares except about the people affected by the news story usually, or unless it's going to affect us as the reader. And again, back to the human dignity question, letting people share for themselves. And so do you guys want to talk about this at all before I move to the next point?
I had a recent interview, but I didn't do it due to the pandemic. I did it in writing. I just asked them to answer the questions that I have, and is that good, or is that somehow defeating also the purpose of interview?
No, we do it however we can do it. When I worked at a newspaper, if I needed to talk to someone, I got in my car and I drove 10 miles to their job or their house, and I sat down and I talked to them. Sometimes I stalked them if they didn't answer my phone calls. I sat in the reception area of their office until they had to come out. I can't do that with Nazarene News because you're there and I'm here. Yeah. So actually, the two pastors that I was telling you that I interviewed this week, we could not find a time in all of our schedules where we could talk on Zoom. They're in Arizona. I'm in Colorado. So finally, as a last resort, I sent them questions in email and they wrote me the questions back. And it worked just fine. Like, it's great. Yeah, no, it's perfectly acceptable. We have to work a little differently because we're spread apart so far as a church. So I'm really thankful for the technology and the time that we live because we have many tools. You can even, I've told people, you can record yourself speaking the answers to the questions I emailed you and send me the audio file. Because some people, it's hard for them to type, or they only have a phone, they don't have a keyboard, or it's faster. They're faster to just quickly talk off a response and digitally send me an audio file. So that's, I mean, we can be very creative. It'll all work just fine. That's a very good question. Yeah. Good question. Any other questions? Okay. If you come up with one, save it and we'll talk about it at the end. Again, I just wanted to have one screen about the lead sentence, the first sentence, because it is so important. It's the most important sentence that you will write in the whole story. You have to capture the reader or they will just stop reading, as I said before. So the lead sentence, the first sentence, we generally say it should not be longer than 20 to 30 words because you will write more paragraphs. So the whole story isn't going to be one big paragraph. And you try to answer as many of the 5 W's and the H as you can fit in that 20 to 30 words. So I sent Lisa a couple of links to some articles that have been featured on the Nazarene News website. And I just looked at the lead sentence of each of those stories. So hopefully you have those links and you're welcome to read the whole story, later. But I did copy and paste the 3 lead sentences on these slides just so we can look at those. Yeah.
I sent those I actually posted those links in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So if we want to refer to it, but you're fine to just go ahead and read it this way. And I will include those in our follow-up message because I see some people that came in that I didn't have contact information for ahead of time. So very good.
Okay. So the first article, the headline I didn't put here. It says, Indiana Church wraps the community in Christ's love through quilts. And quilts are special homemade blankets. And so that's the headline. So we already know from the headline where Indiana, which is in the United States, I suppose outside the US, maybe not everyone knows where Indiana is. It's about a church. So the who in the headline is the church. The where is Indiana. They're showing love to the community, Christ love. So that could be the why or the what. And they're doing it with quilts. So that would be a how. And then we look at the very first sentence, which again is trying to answer as many questions as we can fit. So this is the first sentence. I hope you can see it here. An Indiana Church's quilting ministry. So it's a ministry of people who actually make these handmade quilts. They made 300 quilts for people in their like town or their neighborhood. Since the group first started in 2016, and these quilts are the church's way of wrapping people in Christ's love and the prayers of the congregation. So that's just the first sentence. Did any of you want to match the who, the what, the when to this sentence out loud for the group?
Yeah, let's see if we can get some folks in that haven't asked or spoken yet. Jump in here.
I can start. So I would say the how in this story is they are making quilts for the community would be one how. That's what I matched up together. Does anyone want to try for the when? That might be a little tricky.
It'll be 2016. I started in 2016. So depending on the date of the article, if it was 2021, then it'll be from 2016 to 2021. That'll be the when, right?
Yeah, perfect. So
And
the when is
Rachel,
actually a span of time.
Right. Rachel shares in the chat that who is an Indiana church or their quilting ministry.
Mm-hmm. Both. Both. Those are both like two who's, I guess. There's one more who though.
Oh yeah. Yeah, think about who's receiving.
Mm-hmm.
The community members.
Right. Yeah. So the community is another who in the story. How about the why? Why?
There's no wrong answers, so jump in here,
Yeah.
guys.
Why is the quilting ministry giving away quilts to people in their community?
It's the church's way of wrapping people in Christ's love and prayers, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we
Thanks.
generally covered that one. The next one was an article about a women's clergy conference in the Asia Pacific region. So this is on your region. Did anybody in this group write this article? Do you know?
Rachel and I wrote that article.
That's great.
Excellent.
Yeah. So this also was a really good example of that opening lead. So again, the Asia Pacific region held its first online women's clergy conference this month. The theme of the conference was cultivating the call, advocating and nurturing the call for women in ministry. So do you see some of the who, what, when, where, why, how in this lead sentence? Maybe Grace, do you want to talk about a little bit about writing this? Like, was it easy or was it a little difficult? Did you have to do several versions to get it just right?
Okay, so just a disclaimer, I'm not a writer.
I disagree.
I'm trying to be a writer. That's because it's part of the job that was given to me. So I'm also learning as I go. But what we did with this article was we asked Aileen Ruger, who is our women's ministry coordinator, for the information. And so she drafted the first story, and then we just edit it and make it according to the structure for Nazarene News. So if we will answer the who, what, when, where, I think the who is the with the who is the Asia Pacific region,
Mhm.
and the women who attended the conference,
Mhm.
and men, because there's also men. It's
Yeah.
not just women.
Right.
And so Aggie said also the men.
Yeah,
Thank you, Aggie, for
yeah.
correcting me. And maybe, Rachel also was the one who helped me write this. So what is the Women's Clergy Conference? It's the first online Women's Clergy Conference.
Mhm.
When it happened earlier this month, or October 9, was a
Mhm.
specific date, where it's online event.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's anywhere in the world.
Mhm.
So the why is we want to advocate and nurture the call of women in ministry, which is the theme of the
Mhm.
conference itself. And the how, okay, I need help with the how.
Well, I
Maybe
see that it was online. So
Yeah, it's online.
yeah, what I really like about this lead is you can just know certain things even though it's not clearly spelled out. It's a women's clergy conference, so you don't have to say for women because the reader already will know. And the fact that it was an online conference, you then don't also have to say they held it online. You guys both, and the editors who helped you, did a perfect job of being very, in English, we say concise. So you said the most things with the least number of words necessary, which is a really good skill. Like, not everyone can do that.
Thank you. You encouraged me.
Yeah. And the why, the fact that when you see what the theme of the conference is, you get the what and the why together in one. So you get the what, it was about cultivating and nurturing women in ministry, but the why is the same. So that's why I chose this one, because it really is a great example of a well-written lead sentence.
But there's a need for us to watch the common redundancies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
It's a women's conference for women.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
It's an online and done online.
Right. It's not necessary because the information is already there.
Yeah.
And I will say too that writing is a team sport. So no matter how many years you've been writing or how good you are, you always need an editor or someone else to read it. There will never reach a time when a writer is so good that they don't need an editor. That will never happen.
But isn't it always the fault of the editor?
Yes.
It's always the fault of the editor. I blame it to the editor.
Right. Yes. I also want to just say a note of encouragement, I hope it's encouraging, but I think I was writing professionally every day or every week for several years before I started to really feel comfortable with this kind of writing, because where my background was much more creative. I was a lot more interested in writing fiction or just being very creative. And this is it takes practice. So I wouldn't feel bad if you feel uncomfortable with it, or it feels like a shirt that's too small or doesn't fit well. Because the more you do it, the easier and the more comfortable it will get. So it's something that I think is not natural to anybody who writes. This is probably the most uncomfortable kind of writing, if I can say that. And that's, normal for everyone.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we
Thank
really
you,
appreciate
everyone.
you.